Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, both in the Renate von Metzler Hall at the West End campus of Goethe University and in virtual space joining us from around the world on Zoom. It's a great honor and perhaps an even greater pleasure to act as the moderator of this symposium on insurgency and global orders today. I will introduce the panelists who will be speaking today in a moment, and I will also say a few words about the idiosyncratic form of this symposium. But before I do so, please allow me to say a few words about Pavan Kumar Malreddy, scholar, collaborator, and friend, whose study Insurgent Cultures, World Literature and Violence from the Global South we're launching today. When Pavan joined the Department of Anglophone Literatures and Cultures, also known as the NELC Department, at the Institute of English and American Studies in 2015, first as an independent researcher funded by the German Research Foundation, then as a regular postdoc lecturer, I had great expectations concerning his contributions to the department and his development as a scholar. 9 years later, I'm still a little stunned looking back at the degree to which these expectations have come true. During this time, he played a major role in honing and broadening the profile of NELC. For example, by organizing memorable lecture events with celebrity writers such as Arundhati Roy, Jan Martel, and indeed, Tom McCarthy. Or by co-organizing conferences in Frankfurt, such as the 2020 conference of the Association of Anglophone Postcolonial Studies, GAPS, on English in a World of Strangers, Rethinking World Anglophone Studies, which had to be canceled due to COVID at a very late stage, but which sparked off a joint book publication edited by Pavan and me. And the 2022 GAPS conference on contested solidarities, agency and victimhood, which fortunately did take place, and brought Sinan Antun and Delphine Munoz to Frankfurt. He also played a major role in moving NELC forward by helping to create a high-class, supportive research culture, including doctoral candidates and other postdoc researchers. And of course, he has also been a very conscientious, supportive, and challenging teacher, as it should be, for his students. And he has introduced several cohorts of students to the field of Anglophone literary and cultural studies, and of course also to, in our master program, Moving Cultures, Transcultural Encounters. And of course, he utilized his time at NELC to produce a truly dazzling corpus of publications, including 10 co-edited volumes and special issues of journals, and more than 50 journal articles and book chapters since 2015, culminating, as of now, in the outstanding book that has brought us together today. Insurgent Cultures, World Literatures and Violence from the Global South, was Pavan's habilitation thesis that he defended with panache in late 2022 with a lecture on the right to unbelong, ethics and aesthetics of contemporary migrant literature, that many of us here in Frankfurt remember very well. I was nominally the supervisor of this thesis, but one of the things I quickly learned is that you do not supervise a project of that magnitude. All you can do is act as a hopefully helpful sounding board and sparring partner, and as a mentor who helps to pave the institutional way. The rest is a process of growing side by side, from which I, at least, have immensely profited. Pavan Malreddy will be passing on to greener academic pastures at the beginning of the next year. So the event today is not just the book launch, but also marks the end of a phase of Pavan's academic life, which is why we would like to invite you all to a sparkling farewell party after the academic part of this event is over. Although I'm no longer in active service, I would nevertheless like to use this opportunity to thank you, dear Pavan, for everything you've contributed to NELC, to our institute, to our faculty, and to Goethe University at large. For a phase of intellectual and scholarly collaboration I could not have foreseen 9 years ago, and above all, for your friendship. Both of us, I suppose, and many people at Goethe University and beyond, will not forget these last 9 years. Thank you for everything. And this is a second round of applause for you, Pavan. Now, it is indeed high time to initiate the academic proceedings. And I would like to do so with a few words on the term symposium that you can see on the poster for the event today. Some of you may think that 90 minutes is a bit short for a symposium, but I would like to remind the non-believers among you of the definition of the Cambridge Dictionary that it has for symposium, and it runs like this: an occasion at which people who have great knowledge of a particular subject meet in order to discuss a matter of interest. Now, the definition does not say anything about the length of time these people need to meet and discuss, but I can assure you that the panelists who will be speaking now certainly have great knowledge of a lot of things. The time they have today is rather smaller, however, and limited, 10 minutes each. So let me quickly introduce our guests now in the order in which they will be speaking. We will begin with Sinan Antun, who is joining us tonight by Zoom. He was born and grew up in Baghdad, left for the USA in the wake of the Gulf War of 1991, and today is a professor at New York University's Gallatin School and co-founder and co-editor of the online news platform Jadaliyya. He obtained a doctorate in Arabic literature at Harvard University in 2006 and has published widely on the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish, which he translated himself, on Arab writing, and on the history and politics of Iraq. He's also one of the most prominent authors writing in Arabic today, who has published poetry as well as fiction and essays, self-translated some of his novels into English, and whose work has been widely translated into languages such as English, Norwegian, German, Portuguese, Italian, Spanish, Turkish, Persian, and Malayalam, to name only a few. His novels include, and I'm only quoting the English title for brevity's sake, Ijam, An Iraqi Rhapsody, The Corpse Washer, and The Book of Collateral Damage. He has won numerous prizes and awards, including the Arab American Book Award in 2014 and the Prix de la Littérature Arabe in 2017. His most recent work in English is Postcards from the Underworld, published in 2023, a collection of self-translated poems. The next colleague to speak will be Delphine Munoz, who is a professor of Anglophone postcolonial literatures at the University of Liège, Belgium. Yes?
He's introducing all the speakers.
Sorry? What's going on? Yeah, okay. And she's also the director of a well-known postcolonial research group there. She has published widely on Anglophone postcolonial literatures and US ethnic literatures, with a special focus on minor-to-minor interactions between different postcolonial places and minority histories. She is co-editor with Bénédicte Ledon of the book series Cross Cultures, published with Brill, and the author of After Melancholia, a reappraisal of second-generation diasporic subjectivity in the work of Jhumpa Lahiri, published with Brill, Rodopi in 2013. Her recent publications include co-edited volumes on minor genres in postcolonial literatures, published in 2019, and Carol Phillips's Genealogies, published with Brill in 2023. Our next speaker then will be Tom McCarthy, who was born in Scotland, grew up in London, became a Swedish citizen in the wake of Brexit, and lives in Berlin. I hope that is all correct. Good. He has published works of literary criticism such as Tintin and the Secret of Literature, 2006, and critical essays collected under the title Typewriters, Bombs, and Jellyfish in 2017. But he's probably best known as the author of 5 novels to date: Remainder, Men in Space, Sea, Saturn Island, and most recently, The Making of Incarnation, 2021. His work has been translated into more than 20 languages and adapted for cinema, theater, and radio. He has been shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize and won the Believer Book Award in 2008 and the Wyndham Campbell Literature Prize for Fiction in 2015. Tom McCarthy is also a well-known artist who has held visiting professorships at the Royal College of Art London, Columbia University New York, and the Städelschule right here in Frankfurt, and curated major exhibitions in London and Oslo. He's also general secretary of a semi-fictitious organization, that's the self-description, the International Necronautical Society, INS. Next to speak will be Miriam Nundy, who is professor of modern British literary studies in a global and post-colonial frame at Leipzig University. An interesting designation for a professorship. No, but it explains a lot of what's going on. She obtained her PhD in habilitation at Freiburg University and has published widely on South Asian literature, Black and Asian British literature, post-colonial theory, migrant writing, feminism and globalization, and early modern English diaries. Her introduction to the work of Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak appeared in 2009. Her study, Reading the Early Modern Diary, was published in 2021. She just finished a research project on colonial discourses of idleness. And the last colleague to speak will be Aritro Majumdar, who will join us online via Zoom, and who is professor of English in the English department of the University of Houston, a literary scholar, critical theorist, and intellectual historian. He has published widely on topics such as South Asian and African literature and society, post-colonial critique, globalization and the global South, and world literature. He's also the author of Insurgent Imaginations, World Literature and the Periphery, published with Cambridge University Press in 2020, a book that has played an important role in shaping Pavan Mulready's ideas on insurgent cultures. So, dear all, please greet our guests with a warm round of applause. Right, dear Sinan, the floor is yours. We're looking forward to your talk.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Frank. It's lovely to see you over the screen, and thank you and Pavan for inviting me to be on this distinguished panel. It's a real honor to take part in celebrating this truly illuminating, engaging, and bold book of impressive depth and breadth. I learned so much from it, so thank you, Pavan. I say bold for many reasons. Primarily that if you, Pavan, weren't already on the FBI and CIA's radar, rest assured that their AI agents will soon classify you as an insurgent scholar and person of interest who poses a danger to many. I enjoyed reading this book and learned a lot by unlearning, which I think is very important, thanks to Pavan's unrelenting critical engagement with a host of concepts and critics, and the nuanced and careful manner with which he reframes debates and expands their parameters. I will just highlight a few of the points that stood out, and I apologize if I'm a bit incoherent. I'm under the influence of antibiotics because of a flu. I think many still underestimate the degree to which the discursive machinery of the war on terror and its epistemic violence are still operative in various intellectuals, let alone and cultural spheres. And despite all critiques, unlearning and disrupting these discursive effects of the war on terror is often easier said and claimed than done in practice with tangible results. How does one avoid, neutralize, and make obsolete the conceptual language and discursive tendencies that were, for all intents and purposes, institutionalized and normalized after 9/11? Academic scholarship, literary criticism are not immune at all. Even works whose declared intention and approach is to resist this discursive machine end up reproducing some of its mechanisms, vocabulary, and assumptions, and suffer from what Derrida called residual adherence. This is where this book is bold in achieving what it sets out to do. I quote Pavan, who writes that, quote, "The proponents of world literature have paid little or no attention to the effective scales of violence that pervade our contemporary world order." He mentions how the ideological framing in the first wave of insurgency literature ended up contributing inadvertently to the canonization of mythic violence, one that fed into the post 9/11 discourse of energy security and the war on terror. Just before this, I was on another Zoom, and unfortunately, I was asked to make the case why literature and literary studies are important for other fields and disciplines, and how consequential they are for further understanding societies in this world we inhabit, with all its complexity. There is an eloquent answer in the book that I should have quoted. Although the context is different, it's insurgencies, but to my mind, it applies and it's very important. Quote, "While social science perspectives are primed to explicate the paradoxical phenomena of splintered unity, their empirical overdetermination suffers from both an insufficient attention to cultural phenomena and an inadequate access to reliable sources from the conflict areas. It is here, and these are Pavan's words, at this very disjunctive between critique and conjecture, theory and practice, that the imaginative powers of fiction, films, autobiography, life writing, and other narrative forms come to play a decisive role in articulating the current dynamics of these insurgencies." End of quote. Another important point that struck me, and I think is extremely important, is the corrective of the intrasecular sublime, which Pavan uses in this work. Contrary to the conventional distinction between religious and secular terrorism, and this is a point that's important beyond literary criticism, actually, and so much of the so-called political analyses and critiques that we see. So, distinctions between religious and secular terrorism, these insurgencies exhibit certain intrasecular tendencies in which religious, ethnic, or tribal identities are often used as masks, if not markers, of their secular ambitions to secede or gain control over resources in their lands or assert their rights against majoritarian civic institutions and spaces. In his readings of selected films and world of fiction where the tactical deployment of the religious sublime is a vehicle or a trick to attain secular goals, that was very important. Now, chapter 4 was of special interest to me, not because my work is mentioned, which Pavan honors me by providing such a poetic reading, but because it's closer to my area of expertise. Pavan traces the confluence of formal, aesthetic, and political worlds in the post 9/11 and post Arab Springs vernacular works, whose insurgent figures range from monsters to suicide bombers, Twitter revolutionaries, Facebook martyrs, and corpse washers, all inhabiting and springing from the liminal world at the threshold of life and death. All these figures, Pavan shows us, stage insurrectional plots against their immediate oppressors while mobilizing their militancy through the aesthetic imaginaries of the divine and the sublime. I mean, the breadth and the corpus that Pavan covers is really dizzying, and the reading is so careful and so nuanced. It's rare. In each case, the world and the vernacular are inextricably bound by the intrasecular tropes of insurrection, from the sublime invocation of afterlives in heaven to the execution of divine violence through self-sacrifice to the parading of the dead to complete a revolution. I also appreciated Pavan's focus on irrealism as, quote, the preferred mode of literary expression in this context, and why it is the most privileged to articulate the unspeakable, lost, repressed, or deliberately silenced narratives of victims of structural violence. Now, as a novelist, the book helped me better understand or gave me tools and vocabulary to articulate or describe the space my writings and the writings of other colleagues occupy, because I'm often asked about the space the novels I write occupy. Pavan privileges, quote, the unmediated space between fact and fiction rather than that between truth and lies. The truth of fiction, he suggests, cannot be decided or measured against some outside reality. What matters is how stories enable us to regain some purchase over the events that confound us, humble us, and leave us helpless, he writes. This approach is instrumental to both reading and writing literature against the status quo of repressive governments and despotic leaders, including revolutionary ideologues or the insurgent vanguard. For it provides us not with a means of changing that which we cannot change, but with a way of reimagining it. The book is also an excellent guide, a bird's eye view, but also telescopes into this burgeoning archive of works, a counter-archive, both to state and imperial archives with their vertical hierarchies and exclusionary mechanisms. The critic is a host, and Pavan is a quite generous host in the intellectual space he created and curated also, and in the genuine openness to inviting and including works and authors from Beirut to Burma, to use his phrase. It is a house of wisdom worthy of many readers as guests. And I think I will end here. Thank you so much, Pavan, for writing this book, which I will assign to my students, and thank you for inviting me to be in this symposium.
Thank you so much, Sinan. Thank you very much. And we'll have one contribution after the other. Afterwards, there'll be a brief response by Pavan, and then it will be an open discussion, questions, comments, right, from people in the hall, but also, of course, on Zoom. So I would now like to call on Delphine. And here is the mic.
I am absolutely thrilled to be here in person, emphasis on in person. Even the Dutch ban could not prevent me from attending. So thank you so much, Frank, for bearing with me yesterday and helping me walk through the logistics. So Pavan, my friend, we've been friends and colleagues for years. We first met at a GAPS conference in Chemnitz. I think that was back in 2013. And I remember you were the one suggesting I try a Humboldt postdoctoral fellowship, which I ended up doing here at Goethe University in 2017, 2019. So it feels like Pavan and Frank have accompanied me on my academic journey for a very long time. Thank you. Thank you for being there. Thank you for having me today. Thinking back to that 2013 GAPS conference and to the many times Pavan and I met over the years, I can see now that what truly matters is friendship and connection, of course, but it is also the very possibility of engaging in dialogue. And engaging in dialogue is not as simple as one might think. It requires a lot of skills. It requires a sharp critical mind. It also requires respect, finding the right critical distance, and the ability to listen, to learn how to read. Pavan's powerful monograph, Insurgent Cultures, World Literatures and Violence for the Global South, is dialogue at its best. It is sharp, it is explorative, it is impactful, it takes stock of the myriad conundrums of today's multipolar world. It is also humorous, and it has this centrifugal energy that takes you in and spins you out, getting you to wander far and wide. Insurgent Cultures is about innovative ways of thinking about violence, resistance, community, and solidarity in a post-9/11 moment where the war on terror campaign has unleashed its own rhetorical weapons of mass destruction, namely normative discourses on terrorism and energy security, which are designed to create brain rot and keep out of sight and out of mind the real coordinates of today's ever-shifting power dynamics. Pavan mentions at some point in his book those state-sponsored think tanks on India, Nigeria, Burma, and the Middle East, conflating the discourses of terrorism and energy security at the same time as, I quote, they design military strategies for protecting natural resources in the interests of the safety and stability of world economy. Going through Pavan's book, I was often made to think that Pavan is, in fact, a think tank, or rather, a counter-think tank on his own. For every measure of brain rot generated by these normative discourses, he carefully lays out an innovative vocabulary of resistance, violence, and peripheral solidarities that is fine-tuned to the vernacular realities of Nigeria, the Middle East, India, and Burma. The notion of splintered unity, or unity in disunity, is key to Pavan's understanding of new insurgency cultures in the Global South, where insurgent groups struggle not just for demarcating, but for defending cultural and resource boundaries. Well beyond oversimplistic post-colonial paradigms, which appear to be frozen in time in a logic of enchantment, where the Fanonian take on violence as redemptive justice is still future-faking a post-independence moment, invalidating the very necessity of insurgency. Pavan is well aware of the fact that there's been a carryover of violence between colonial and neoliberal times in various post-colonies since the 1960s and the 1970s, meaning that, as he puts it, many post-colonial nation-states now replicate the colonizers' model of violence in suppressing dissent, difference, or minority groups within the nation. Today's insurgent culture, I would like to suggest, after reading Pavan's book, is hustler, go-getter culture. There might be no redemption, no greater cause, no bright future, no liberation, no big other, to use Slavoj Žižek's terminology. But there are ever-shifting organizing strategies wielded by insurgent groups who seek the radical uprooting of the system, and while doing so, do not shy away from retooling their political agenda, not only in the service of greater causes, but also in the service of small causes. And I think this is exactly what you show in your book. And such a multifaceted insurgent retooling requires, in turn, a fine-tuning of one's critical vocabulary and theoretical toolbox to make sense of insurgent cultures. I think it is not enough to say that the breadth of scholarship used in Pavan's book is mind-blowing. Likewise, it is not enough to say that Pavan's reading of high cultural texts, together with popular cultural products like Tollywood films or spy thrillers from Burma, bears witness to this centrifugal energy taking you in and then taking you out of your comfort zone, getting you to wander far and wide again. Indeed, the mobilization of an impressive corpus across literary genres and the breadth of scholarship mean nothing when they fail to decode the complex language of violence and counter-violence at play in the global south. One passage sticks in mind in your book. I'm referring to the opening of the Indian chapter entitled Violent Solidarities, narrating the Maoist insurgency in India, where Pavan strives to decode the fictional and mythical terms used in real life by an old man reminiscing about the arrival of a Naxalite rebel in central India. Such decoding is not a matter of reading books and then reading more books. It requires Pavan to listen hard. And it's only after turning to the local archives and speaking with his guide that Pavan manages to come up with a narrative. It goes like that. Several Naxalites, which were presented as buffaloes, entered the Danda Kahania from Andhra Pradesh, which was coded as Pakistan. And one of them got killed by the police, and we swallowed the secret of the dead buffalo. That is the secret of the dead Naxalite rebel. Says a lot about, learning how to read, right? And Pavan quips in the book, well, some of the urban myths surrounding the arrival of Naxalism in central India are so acerbic that they would need a trained formalist of Roman Jakobson's stature to decipher their inner essence. Of course, this anecdote is multifaceted because it emphasizes again that genuine scholarship is about engaging in dialogue, engaging with the world, with other critics, but also being in dialogue with beyond ourselves that can only take place if we learn how to read, if we listen hard, if we also attend to these lateral moves and unanticipated passes that writers and life throws around your way. And I think you're one of the people doing just that. So thank you, an amazing achievement.
Thank you, Delphine. Thank you very much. And I will now call on Tom.
Great, thanks. Can you hear me okay? Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's a great honor. And I can't presume for a second to comment with any authority on this enormously rich range of works that Pavan is bringing to my attention, certainly, from Iraq, Nigeria, Burma, and so on, to my attention almost in every case for the first time. But what I can attempt to do, and this is really just a thought experiment. I don't think I'm right. Maybe it's a thought experiment. But my response to the book would be to try and kind of transfer a kind of logic back to the tradition or corpus, the much more normative one that I grew up with. And I'm going to talk more about corpuses in a minute. But reading Pavan's book, I started to suspect that just as for Deleuze and Guattari, minor minor literature is actually what they call the revolutionary conditions for every literature within the heart of what is called great or established literature. Or, for example, just as Glissant, errancy, which he discerns in this Caribbean heritage of displacement and marronage and archipelagism and so on, that this errancy is in fact, is actually the heart from Villon onwards of so-called rooted European literature. So rooted culture is just basically, for Glissant, rooted culture is just errant culture that has misread itself, missed the glaring fact of its own errancy. That by the same token, perhaps insurgency, which Pavin discerns in the global self and sketches so lucently, that perhaps, this is my thought experiment, that perhaps this very insurgency might turn out to be the core logic of supposedly, imperial literature. And I think the key concept here is necropolitics, or necropolitics and violence, that Pavin kind of transforms out of his reading of Abembe. So in Pavan's reading, imperial violence is necropolitics from above, insurgent violence is necropolitics from below. He makes the link, like Derrida when he talks about différance, he makes the link via Antigone in The Tomb of the Tyrant. So necro, the politics of the corpse. I have that wonderful section on Sinan's The Corpse Washer. But reading that, many literary bodies, corpuses from Western literature come to mind. I mean, obviously, the prime one would be Frankenstein's monster, which forms the basis of another brilliant reading by Pavin of Ahmed Sadawi's Frankenstein in Baghdad, on which it's based. But I'd say even in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, this global this necropolitics, this double necropolitics is already at play. I mean, you've got the master, the necropolitical violence from above of the master, the creator, and then the counter-violence of the monster. And if we really think about that original context, it opens up in all kinds of directions. I mean, given that it's basically a cryptic novel about the Luddites, the machine breakers, reacting against the punch card looms, hence early digital culture, that were replacing them, i.e. textile, weaving factories, hence cotton, hence empire, hence slavery, right? I mean, already the global south and racialized captive labor is part of this story. It's operative in Mary Shelley's book already. Another body that comes to mind would be a Conradian body, the body of Stevie on the slab, on the mortuary slab in Greenwich, where I grew up. Again, Greenwich, this place totally inseparable from empire, from histories of migration, global control, and time. I'll come back to time in a minute, which are accordingly the core concepts of Conrad's novel, The Secret Agent, with its many immigrants and imperial embassies and temporal jumps and so on. And the third body, the third corpse that I immediately thought of reading Pavan's book would be all the corpuses of the literary corpses in Ulysses in the library, in the National Library of Dublin. Stephen describes all the books around him as coffined thoughts around me in mummy cases, embalmed in spice, another signifier of global trade and capital, embalmed in spice of words. And then he senses in them this kind of whisper. He says, again, totally necropolitics, he says, an itch of death is in them to tell me in my ear a maudlin tale, urge me to wreak their will, i.e. to write. So, writing itself, the writing to which Stephen is kind of commanded, would be that very act of necropolitics from below, violence from the tomb, put it in Antigone's. So, again here, already, this is what I learned reading back to the global north from Pavan's study, is that, the way that rebellion, agency, and writing are all kind of constellated around this necropolitical moment. And I guess in Conrad, if If you know The Secret Agent, you'll know that the Russian embassy is saying to Verloc, enough with the writing. You send us all these reports. They're rubbish. We can't do anything with them. We want action, action. Enough words. We want action. No more writing. Make something happen. In Joyce, these start to blur, right? I mean, writing itself would be a form of violence. There's another marginal figure in Ulysses, Kevin Egan, who is the Fenian bomber based on Joseph Casey, who prompts that wonderful line, I hear the ruin of all space, shattered glass and toppling masonry, and time one final livid flame. And Stephen has a loop back to meeting Kevin Egan in Paris, where having been a bomber, he's now a typesetter. And his fingers are covered in, they used to be covered in black gunpowder, now they're covered in black ink. As he rolls, how does Stephen put it? He rolls rolling gunpowder cigarettes through fingers smeared with printer's ink, which should recall that, the book begins in the Martello Tower, a massive, a gunpowder storage room. So there's this implicit link between gunpowder and ink, which Joyce kind of, in Finnegan's Wake, plays out through the double meaning of the word magazine. The magazine of a gun, the magazine as a literary organ. Finally, sorry, this is just a kind of set of associations, but finally this thought of the kind of avant-gardes and violence and typography leads me to think of Mallarmé, for whom typography is a right, R-I-T-E. And Mallarmé's reflections on temporality, the fact that he was very close to the bomb throwers of the 1890s, but never actually engaged in propaganda by deed himself. And I come back to Pavan's definition of insurgency, which is a temporal, very interesting temporality. He links it to this specific temporality of being in a gerundive temporality, right? Being insurge, being on the rise. He talks about, Pavan writes, it is in the time that lapses between ticking and explosion, in the worlds inhabited by the insurgents between killing and dying, that insurgent cultures take shape. If thus insurgency can be defined as being in surge, being on the rise, like the fount of explosive fire against some first order of violence, be it semiotic, symbolic, or objective, this is still Pavan, then an insurgent culture is one that internalizes such violent surging up from below as a routine course of communal life, as opposed to a cathartic revolutionary event. So it's a mode rather than a fixed event. It's an immanence or an imminence. And this really, this speaks very much to me as someone who wrote a novel whose hero is called Surge, and followed up with the next one with an epigraph taken straight from Mallarmé's Action Restrained, where Mallarmé writes, he writes that he imagines the traveler hearing this cry of space. And the traveler says, probably, he persuades himself, we are going through a tunnel, the epoch, the last long one, snaking under the city to the all-powerful train station of the virginal central palace like a crown. That's Mallarmé's. And of course, sovereignty is what's at play here, the crown. But it's an ambivalent sovereignty, right? Arriving at the palace could be interpreted as kind of assuming that sovereign spot, taking over power, assuming the imperial role. But it could be also imagined as the storming of the palace, the sovereignty of insurrection, the Winter Palace, the Bastille. And elsewhere in that piece, Action Restrained, and this, I'll stop on this, Mallarmé says he's moving towards, he calls it certain extreme conclusions about art which can explode diamantinely in this forever time in the integrity of the book. He says these conclusions are pulsing in the unknown womb of the hour, but only evident or only graspable within this framework of a kind of exploded temporality. He writes, time unique in the world, since because of an event I have still to explain, there is no present. No, a present does not exist. Ill-informed anyone who would announce himself his own contemporary, deserting, usurping with equal impudence, when the past ceased and a future is slow to come, or when both are mingled perplexedly to cover up the gap. And he concludes, so watch out and be there. It's a great line. So this is what I'm kind of groping towards with this thought experiment, a suspicion that Pavan has identified in this notion of insurgency the very motor of the avant-garde and perhaps of literature itself. And for that and everything else in the book, I'm extremely grateful. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. And Miriam, I'd like to call on you now.
Thank you. Right. Good evening. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, for your hospitality. Delphine already mentioned we're sort of among friends, right? So I'm going to share with you like a tiny anecdote. I kept being distracted from reading your wonderful book and from writing this paper because I'm on a committee on best practice models on large language models and AI. Yeah, the collateral damage that the neoliberal university does to language. So I thought, okay, I sort of lost my nerve, and I fed the prompt, write a 10-minute speech for the book launch of Pawan Mayureddy's Insurgent Cultures into ChatGTP. So here it is, it's fast. Sentence I'm quoting from ChatGTP. Dr. Mayureddy's Insurgent Cultures ventures into territories that demand both courage and nuance. It's uncanny. It's uncanny because, of course, it's a book of both courage and nuance. But, you know, ventures into territory, that constructs the scholar as some sort of late colonial adventurer, or shall I say conqueror, which is not what you are, Pawan, which is not what we are, it's not what we do. And yeah, of course, as I know now, having worked more with ChatGTP as I ever meant to, it's a model that just calculates the statistical likelihood of one signifier following another. So it's basically sort of like a drop-down menu. And I'm quoting from a recent article in PMLA that I think sort of captures the spirit of ventures into territory. It turns out that the meta-narratives did not collapse. They simply moved to the drop-down menu. So at its core, Insurgent Cultures unmasks and unsettles the drop-down menu. That it unmasks and unsettles the language that constructs the scholar as an adventurer or insurgency as terrorism. Moreover, the book also moves beyond the nostalgic frames of heroism. It navigates the skilla of villainizing the global south as an inherently violent space and the characters of romanticizing insurgency. In none of his many incredibly well-chosen examples, literary examples, be it a piece of investigative journalism on oil extractivism in the Niger Delta, be it a novel by Jhumpa Lahiri. You have questions on Lahiri, please ask Delphine. Or Frankenstein in Baghdad. But in none of these incredible texts do we encounter heroic freedom fighters or a coherent sort of theory of the revolution. And yet, these narratives are entirely misread if framed within the semantic coordinates of terrorism, a term that served the colonizers very well, as Powart shows in his tremendous study. In terms of its historical scope, Insurgent Cultures focuses on what Derek Gregory has called the colonial present, the insurgency literature of the war on terror, so-called war on terror decades, which were also marked, and I knew that sort of, but I think it took Pawan to bring that to my attention, that also this decade was also marked by a crackdown on local insurgencies in many post-colonial states. Distinguishing present-day insurgencies from mid-century decolonial movements, Pawan highlights, I quote, the diffused, disintegrated, and disenfranchised nature of armed conflicts, unquote. What a phrase. Not every critic can pull off an alliteration in a definition of a political category, and the political category still being very lucid. I don't think I could, but Pawan, scholar and stylist extraordinaire, totally can pull it off. Insurgent Cultures deserves to be read for its storytelling, for its stylistic elegance alone. But of course, we should also read the book because of its tremendous transdisciplinary scope that encompasses political philosophy, subaltern studies, world literature, and is nevertheless firmly grounded in an acute understanding of the historical and political backgrounds and the specific literatures it discusses. As I said, the monograph does cover, many people pointed out that before, a sort of really wide range of texts and contexts, but it never generalizes or post-colonializes the specific voices or contexts away. In this vein, Pawan does not engage with the method of distant reading, tempting though it may have been. Instead, he argues via Amir Mufti that we need, I quote, a better close reading strategy, a way of reading that is attentive to the worldliness of language and texts, unquote. In terms of its theoretical rigor, its ethical political outlook, its nuanced and analytical understanding of textuality, Insurgent Cultures is an exemplary piece of post-colonial critique in Said's and Spivak's sense. Yet it also resonates with, and this might be a bit of a provocation, with the post-critical call to shift the mood from detachment, from sort of the blasé notion of taking aesthetic distance to an effective attachment. Pawan's readings are colored by the affect of caring for literature, for its textures and imaginative possibilities. Furthermore, and this is crucial, I think, his work also conveys a deep sense of affective attachment to the spaces and the people, its people, not collateral damage, that are devastated by violent conflict. At the same time, and it really squares a circle here, his literary analyses are rigorous, textually embedded, philosophically abstract, and historically grounded in a way that is absolutely outstanding. We're convening here as fellow literary critics or people interested in literature, and I guess maybe some of you have noticed how often I've used conjunctions such as however, still, yet, but, or phrases such as A without B. A better writer such as Pawan here would have gotten rid of the repetitions. I cling to them, however, because they illustrate yet one more merit of the book. By dint of its lucid analysis of insurgency literatures, Pawan's work also articulates the conflicts and contradictions that can never be fully solved or synthesized. In other words, his study is informed by, I think, sort of a tinge of negative dialectics inherent in our discipline at the historical moment in which we find ourselves. And in this sense, it's very much a Frankfurt book, albeit reaching out to many, many other parts of the world. And with this, I would like to close and thank you, my dear Frankfurt hosts, and you, my dear listeners, on Zoom and in other pockets of the world, and congratulate you, Pawan, and thank you for this incredible achievement.
I will next call on Oritro, but first of all, could we perhaps try to disentangle the images? We've had a quite cubistic mise en abîme experience.
So, good evening, to the chair, fellow speakers and guests. It's my pleasure to be here and an honor to share these remarks with you. I work in the same academic subfield as Professor Pawan Malreddy, that of world literature and theory. Malreddy's Insurgent Cultures offers us a novel proposition, namely that, as the book's subtitle states, contemporary world literatures in the plural are conjoined with violence from the global south. The book explores this through a variety of literary genres, novels, autobiographies, and journalistic accounts spanning a vast area: India, Myanmar, Nigeria, and several countries and regions of West Asia. However, despite the impressive panoramic framework, the conceptual thrust of the book is not space but time. Malreddy underlines a vital moment: the September 2001 World Trade Center attacks in New York City and the subsequent American response in the global war on terror. The latter, he insists, must be seen neither simply in the context of the US-led invasions and regime changes in Afghanistan and Iraq, nor only the surveillance of Arabs and Muslims, but also in the little remarked contexts of post-colonial securitization elsewhere. Doing so connects the anti-terror measures in West Asia to those in the Indian heartlands, the coastal Nigerian delta, and the frontiers of Myanmar, peripheral regions housing some of the world's longest-running insurgencies. Displacing specialized notions of the global south as inherently chaotic, Insurgent Cultures foregrounds the historical nature of violence and world-making. Further, the contemporary is not all that is previously solid melts into air, but inherits the traces of the past. Global South literatures across languages and genres serve as privileged sites for articulating the heterogeneous aesthetic and affective forms of splintered violence. And this is Malreddy's phrase. I want to stress how this conceptualization of literature's worlding, the latter a term that Malreddy adopts from the late Palestinian American critic Edward Said, upends current notions of world literature specifically and critical thinking more generally. Both as an English and comparative literature professor at Columbia University and advocate for Palestinian self-determination, Said exemplified the oppositional intellectual that he upheld in his scholarship. Eruditely and with unmatched passion, he demonstrated that the concept of literature, which cohered around the late 18th century, served as a handmaiden to colonialism and empire. And yet, literary representation also contained other counter-hegemonic possibilities. In one of the last interviews before his death in 2003, Said arguably highlighted Insurgent cultures fighting against extinction and obliteration, stressing that, quote, culture is a form of memory against effacement, unquote. This during a paradigm shifting moment when conversations on world literature and the post 9/11 national security state were entering the academy, albeit from different ends. Retrospectively, the influential texts of the former, including Casanova's World Republic of Letters, published in 1999 with an English translation in 2007, Moretti's Conjectures on World Literature, published in 2000, and Damrosch's What is World Literature, 2003, could be productively read as statements of the latter. Already in 2001, the American literary critic Timothy Brennan, a former student of Said, had scathingly characterized metropolitan cultural criticism as marked by a Kantian cosmopolitanism. Criticism, in other words, was masking rather than illuminating reality, falsely projecting, no, celebrating a world without borders when the very opposite was being violently erected. More than 2 decades later, I find Said's and Brennan's echoes in Insurgent Cultures' subtle criticism of the cosmopolitan basis of world literature. As Malreddy observes, and I quote, a good deal of the world literature debate today is preoccupied with the idea of the coming together and competing of national letters on a world stage, subject to the aesthetic protocols imparted by the literary traditions of the metropolis, unquote. Consider a brief thought experiment. Replace, in the sentence that I just quoted, counterinsurgency or anti-terrorism for world literature, law for letters, and so on, and the categorical imperative of violence appears. For it now reads, quote, a good deal of the counterinsurgency or anti-terrorism debate today is preoccupied with the idea of the coming together and competing of national legal frameworks on a world stage, subject to the juridical protocols imparted by the legal traditions of the metropolis, unquote. Countering such a thrust, Malreddy proposes, and I quote, a demotic appropriation of the law and order by the parole of the people, unquote. While this specific formulation is indebted to Sassurian structural linguistics, namely the distinction between long and parole, it is nonetheless removed from structuralist analysis. Neither can it be reduced to a Nietzschean contrast of order and disorder, where the latter inevitably risks collapsing into the former. Malreddy's emphasis on temporality, as noted previously, bristles against the anti-historicism of both of these theoretical tendencies. Rather, in the gallery of critics that he affirms, among others, C.L.R. James, Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, and Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, and the singular position he enunciates, namely, quote, a struggle-based, subject-centered, and resistance-laden conception of the world, unquote, Malreddy appears to be invoking a much older tradition. I identify this as left Hegelian internationalism. If the global war on terror bookends Malreddy's work from one side, then its other side surely would be the present conjuncture. I hazard this claim since it's only implicit in Malreddy's account, but nonetheless, it strikes me as his most significant insight. Just this past week, the Indian writer Amitav Ghosh in his acceptance speech for the 2004 Erasmus Prize in the Netherlands, quietly noted, and I quote at length, "Whatever might be our opinions on the rights and wrongs of the current conflicts in Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, and Ukraine, it is now self-evident that it is no longer possible for the West to dictate solutions through force of arms, as it once did. It has lost its erstwhile superiority in applying organized violence. This loss has been accompanied also by an accelerating erosion of the West's financial and industrial dominance, and the West's structures of governance are now in danger of swerving disastrously off course." End of quote. Arguably, someone of lesser stature than Ghosh, or perhaps with more unforgiving hosts, would have had, at this point in the speech, their mic cut, prize monies taken away, or worse. The Western sole prerogative in organized violence is waning, and its liberal cosmopolitan description of the world is in crisis. Whether we are allowed to discuss it is one concern, but also how we do so is another. The latter is precisely the issue Mulready poses. I would submit that insurgent cultures extends beyond the context of world literature and the micro concepts of violence, vital as these are. Rather, it raises even weightier questions about the role of critical humanist thought. I end with the words of the Arab American literary critic and my Houston colleague, Hossam Abulela, who reflects that, quote, "Today in our US environment," and I suppose we can extend this to other contexts as well, an increasingly narrow section of the professoriate can focus on the theoretical. The ability to theorize, to focus on thought and method, should be part of our basic working conditions. End of quote. Thank you for your time.